Living in Australia is harder than you think. In 2017, buying a home in Sydney would set you back around $1,800 per square meter. Today, that price has nearly doubled to $2,800, a staggering 60% increase in less than a decade. And it's not just Sydney. In the 8 years since 2017, property prices nationwide have risen by nearly 65%, faster than almost anywhere else in the world. But wages haven't kept pace. The average salary has barely moved in years. And in real terms, many Australians are earning less than they did before the 2008 crisis. This is more than just a housing problem. There is a cost of living crisis, a rental crisis, and now even an immigration crisis, though not in the way you might think. Because the real pressure isn't coming from asylum seekers or refugees, it's coming from tourists, temporary workers, and wealthy foreign investors. As a result, Sydney is now the second most unaffordable place to live in the world. So how and why did we end up here?
Has it just become normal to feel poor in Australia?
Across the Western world, the housing market is under stress, but there is something fundamentally different about Australia.
I am nearly 27 years old, and today I am moving back in with my parents.
Home ownership is becoming less and less attainable for many Australians, especially young Australians.
Rental affordability is at its worst level in at least 17 years.
Young people have not had the luxury to benefit from skyrocketing home values and are constantly playing catch-up. The result? Home ownership rates for people under 34 have declined nearly 25%. Because of this, the demand for rental properties is insane. One of the most shocking examples of Australia's housing crisis came from Brisbane, where a landlord advertised a single bed inside a garden shed for $500 a week on Facebook Marketplace. Another landlord went as far as renting out his balcony, and judge for yourself if the price is worth it.
So what's the deal with privacy between your sunny bedroom here and the rest of the unit?
What makes Australia's situation different is that they used to be the top of the class in terms of affordability, the percentage of people who owned their house, and they had few disadvantaged neighborhoods. But that changed. In the 1950s, Australia was doing well. They had some of the best living standards in the world, and the economy was growing. This is when the Great Australian Dream was popularized. The ideal became to own a detached house on a quarter-acre block in the suburbs, with a garden and a hold-in. The true Australian car. It became affordable to own a car, and there was a demand for space. This led Australian cities to spread out. Today, Melbourne is 6 times larger than London, but with fewer inhabitants. Sydney is even more extreme. It is 14 times larger than Berlin, but with only 2 million more inhabitants. The government stimulated home ownership with policies like the First Home Owner Grant. All these efforts worked. Home ownership jumped from 52% in 1950 to a peak of 71% in 1968. This happened in other countries as well, but Australia was top of the class. The Great Australian Dream is the belief that home ownership will lead to a better and more prosperous life. This was backed up by government policies that kept housing affordable and within reach. So housing is a fundamental part of the Australian way of life. Their houses used to be exceptionally affordable, and they had high rates of home ownership. That all turned upside down, and this is now an issue. So that begs the question, where did it actually go wrong? The first culprit that many point to is immigration. The government recently said the migration system is broken and needs a massive reform. Between 2022 and 2023, Australia welcomed almost 740,000 new arrivals, the highest number in modern history, and 200,000 more than before the pandemic. The result? More people chasing the same limited housing supply, a formula that inevitably drives prices up. Specifically, economists and analysts believe that immigration has primarily impacted rental housing. The bulk of immigrants to Australia are temporary visa holders, and 70% of them are renters. The effects are felt strongest in suburbs with large migrant communities. Take Melbourne's southeast or Sydney's inner southwest, where rents have surged by 18% just in the past year alone. On top of that, many immigrants are willing to share their living spaces with more people to make ends meet, often outbidding locals for rentals. This has pushed rental yields to levels Australia hasn't seen in decades. But when it comes to housing prices, blaming immigrants as the main cause just doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Australia's migration rate has actually decreased over the last decade and is in line with historical averages. However, over the preceding years and decades, there is one big difference. While immigration has continued to grow with the population, housing starts have declined. The construction industry is facing a catch-22, with the cost of building a new home rising again in 2023. 170,000 dwellings were completed, the lowest amount in a decade. At the same time, Australia saw the biggest spikes in immigration in a generation. So, what gives? Since 1966, the number of homes being built relative to the population of Australia has been declining. Specifically, in the year 2000, building rates fell off a cliff, creating a significant supply shortage whose impact can still be felt today. A big part of why Australia's housing construction has slowed down comes down to culture. Australia is a very suburban environment where communities and citizens have opted for urban sprawl over densification. For example, Sydney and Melbourne have about 2,000 people per square kilometer. Compare this to 6,000 in London, 4,400 in Munich, and 3,600 in Amsterdam. It is a shocking difference when compared to other major Western cities. Australian cities are some of the least densely populated in the world. Many Australians believe that a suburban environment is ideal for raising families and safe communities. Thankfully, Australia has a ton of land that is mostly unpopulated. Theoretically, they can continue to build outward and maintain sprawl. Sydney alone could add 280,000 homes in its greenfield growth areas, but sadly, this would work in theory. But Australia has a major NIMBY problem. Even though Australia is going through an extreme housing crisis, March 2024 saw the lowest number of detached home approvals since 2012. These aren't high-rise condos, these are detached, single-family suburban homes. Strong community advocacy and government red tape lead to extremely long approval times for housing developments. For example, to receive an approval for a single home development in New South Wales, it takes 111 days on average. In Liverpool, that jumps to 288 days. Compare this to Texas, where it generally takes less than a week. These long wait times have made it impossible for the government to achieve home building targets. Australia is on track to build 40% fewer homes than what's needed, falling far short of its own affordable housing targets. The problem isn't just demand, it's approvals. A sluggish planning system has created artificial land scarcity. And that scarcity has sent land prices soaring. Since 2020, house values have climbed 3 times faster than apartments. With land becoming such a scarce resource, it further challenges developments as it becomes increasingly expensive to acquire and develop land economically. But this is almost entirely by design. Scarce land benefits homeowners. This has had a tremendous impact on young people in particular. Remember, home ownership rates for young people have dropped by 25% compared to only 8% for the general population. We can all agree that immigration and low development rates are worsening Australia's housing crisis. But there is another critical factor at play: tax incentives. During the 1930s, Australia had a major housing shortage and wanted to encourage investment in rental properties. To encourage this, the country introduced negative gearing. Negative gearing allows an investor to offset the losses on a rental property against their personal income. For instance, you can deduct $10,000 from your personal income tax if you earn $100,000 annually and lose $10,000 on your rental property. It's a rare concept. Only Japan and New Zealand have policies like this across the entire OECD. Australia tried to change it once. Similar to the UK, the government attempted to alter negative gearing regulations in the 1980s by limiting the amount of deductions that could be taken. Back in the 1980s, the government moved to restrict negative gearing by capping deductions. But the backlash was fierce, and before long, the old rules were quietly brought back. As the old adage goes, you can give, but you can never take. In the 1980s, the government removed interest rate limits, making it far less expensive for Australians to purchase homes with debt. This increased the appeal of negative gearing and made it possible to use debt as leverage to execute the strategy. Now, this alone isn't enough to put Australia over the edge. Not only can you leverage negative gearing, but you can also hold real estate investments in your retirement account known as a super. Think of a super like an Australian version of an IRA. It comes with major tax perks, especially for real estate. Rental income is taxed at just 15%, not your full marginal rate. And unlike the US, where using an IRA to buy property is expensive and complicated, in Australia, it's simple. In fact, it's often encouraged. But that isn't all. There's more. In 1999, the Australian government reduced capital gains on real estate sales by 50%. And if you are holding your property in a super, you're effectively only paying a 10% tax. There is almost no country on earth that has such a favorable tax regime for property investors. Australia is truly exceptional. This tax regime has been criticized heavily. The argument against it is that it materially benefits landowners and older Australians. And frankly, the argument is quite sound. These tax policies have encouraged speculation in real estate and are costing taxpayers nearly $8 billion per year. Some might argue that this is overblown, but when 50 to 80% of all investment properties are negatively geared, there is a problem. A system that encourages speculation on income-losing properties is highly flawed and very unique. But this has created another challenge. Australia has made it so good to invest in non-productive assets like real estate that no one bothers to invest in anything else. What, however, does make it harder and harder for Australians to get by and afford basics like housing is, of course, stagnant wages. As we mentioned before, when accounting for inflation, Australians haven't seen a real pay increase since 2009, and this is due to productivity, a fundamental aspect of economic growth. Productivity is the rate at which goods and services are produced in an economy through inputs like labor. And productivity has been weak in Australia for the last 20 years, far below previous figures. Because of this, economic growth has remained weak, especially when accounting for a slowdown in exports to China, which drove this figure in the early 2000s. Across the economy in 2022, productivity fell by around 4% as output failed to keep pace with a record 6.9% increase in the number of hours worked. In fact, Australian incomes grew in the last couple of years, mainly because they worked more hours, but productivity growth is about working smarter, not working harder or longer. One way Australian companies can work smarter is by investing in research and development to innovate on new ideas. R&D spending in Australia is currently far lower than in most other OECD countries and far lower than developed countries like America or the United Kingdom. While stagnant productivity is bad, it's also a burden that is predominantly being felt by the average working Australian who are seeing wages remain stagnant while the price of everything else continues to increase relative to income. Declining productivity has also allowed inequality to persist and deepen. In terms of income inequality, Australia isn't doing that bad, as its Gini coefficient of 0.35 ranks in line with other similar economies. However, when we turn to look at the gap in wealth, the picture becomes a bit worse. In Australia, nearly half of all wealth is held by the top 10% of households, worth an average of $5.2 million each, and they hold 15 times the wealth of the lowest 60%. This shouldn't really be a surprise based on what we have described so far, as when assets like houses are appreciating far quicker than incomes, there will inevitably be a huge gap developing between those lucky enough to own assets and those who do not. In fact, the senior economist at the Australia Institute has described the country's growing inequality as on steroids. This was based on a report which showed that 93% of the economic gains in the previous decade went to the top 10%, while an overwhelming majority of Australians saw just 7% of the benefit, a figure which is far greater than any point in Australian history. Inequality slows down a country's economic growth. When this gap widens, people with lower incomes tend to spend less, but they are the ones who would usually spend extra money if they had it, unlike wealthier individuals. As the rich get richer, they often invest in things like the financial market and real estate, and while they increase their wealth, they are less likely to contribute to economic growth by creating new businesses or jobs. At the same time, people with lower incomes can't afford important things like a good education, which limits their opportunities to improve their lives and contribute more effectively to the economy. It's worth noting that the level of wealth inequality in Australia is still far below the global average and below countries like the US and the UK. But this is an issue which gets worse every year. And as a country becomes more unequal, issues start to arise as there is a growing sense of discontent, especially amongst the majority who feel downtrodden. With economic issues, especially surrounding housing and inequality, it's easy to point the blame on a single individual or government, but the reality is that these issues have been growing in Australia for decades and have been consistently ignored by multiple governments on both sides of the political spectrum. These are issues which are in dire need of addressing and require cross-party collaboration to solve, but given the current track record on housing and the current lack of urgency to do something about it, it looks like this and many other issues will persist in Australia for many years to come.